Melissa sat at her parents' kitchen table, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup as she listened to their latest demand. The air in the room was thick with tension, and the smell of her mother's lavender-scented candles did little to mask the sour taste of betrayal forming in her mouth. The sun streamed through the window, casting long shadows over the polished oak table where they had once shared countless family meals. But this wasn't a family dinner. It was an interrogation. Her father, Harold, leaned forward, his knuckles tapping impatiently against the table. "You need to sell your house, Melissa," he said, his tone sharp, leaving no room for argument. "Nathan needs that money for his divorce settlement." Melissa blinked, stunned. She had known this conversation was coming. Her mother had dropped enough hints over the past few weeks, but hearing it spoken so plainly still hit her like a slap. She had worked tirelessly to build a life for herself, pouring every ounce of energy into her bakery, living in a cramped apartment for years until she could finally afford her dream home. And now, her parents expected her to throw it all away for her brother, the family's golden boy, who had never worked a real day in his life. "You're asking me to sell my house?" "For Nathan," Melissa repeated slowly, trying to keep her voice steady. Her mother, Diane, let out a heavy sigh, as if exhausted by Melissa's reluctance. "It's not just for Nathan," she insisted. "It's for family. We help each other." Melissa scoffed. "We help Nathan, you mean? Where was this family support when I was maxing out credit cards to open my bakery? When I was working 16-hour days and sleeping in a studio apartment?" Harold's eyes narrowed. "That was different. You were being stubborn, insisting on that little bakery of yours when you could have had a stable job. But Nathan's situation is serious. Claire is taking everything, and without our help, he'll have nothing." Melissa clenched her jaw. Nathan's nothing was still more than most people's everything. He had spent the last decade living in a luxury condo, hosting lavish parties, driving sports cars, and vacationing in the south of France, all funded by Claire's high-powered legal career. Meanwhile, Melissa had spent those same years working tirelessly, waking before dawn to knead dough and bake pastries, handling every aspect of her business alone. Now, after years of indulgence, Nathan was facing the reality of his reckless spending, and their parents expected her to fix it. "Nathan made his choices," Melissa said firmly. "Just like I made mine. It's not my responsibility to clean up his mess." Her mother's face crumpled as if Melissa had just shattered something fragile and precious. "How can you be so cold?" she whispered. "Your own brother is about to lose everything." Melissa almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Nathan's idea of losing everything meant downsizing from a penthouse to a standard apartment. He wasn't facing homelessness, he was facing normalcy, something he had never had to experience before. "He can get a job," she suggested, earning a dramatic gasp from Diane. "A job?" her mother repeated, pressing a hand to her chest as if the very suggestion had physically hurt her. "Nathan has no experience. He's never had to work like that before. You know how sensitive he is." Melissa's stomach twisted. This was the same argument she had heard her entire life. While she had been pushed to be independent, Nathan had been coddled, shielded from responsibility at every turn. He had failed business ventures, spent through allowances, and lived off others' success, all while Melissa had been expected to stand on her own. And now they wanted her to sacrifice everything she had built to continue that pattern? Melissa shook her head. "I'm sorry," she said, standing up and pushing her chair back. "But I'm not selling my house. Nathan will have to figure this out himself." Her father's fingers drummed ominously against the table. Her mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Melissa knew this wasn't over. The worst was yet to come. Melissa had always known that Nathan was the favorite. It wasn't something their parents ever said outright, but it was woven into the fabric of their childhood, stitched into every decision, every sacrifice she had been expected to make. While she spent summers working at the local bakery to save for college, Nathan was off at elite tennis camps and European vacations because networking was important for his future. When she had to take out student loans and work late-night shifts to put herself through culinary school, their parents dipped into the family savings to fund Nathan's business degree, even though he never finished. While she lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment, struggling to make rent while building her bakery from scratch, Nathan was gifted a down payment on a penthouse condo in the city, and yet it was always Melissa who was labeled the self-sufficient one, the one who didn't need help, while Nathan was the sensitive one who needed to be supported at all costs. Even when she opened her bakery, her parents treated it like a hobby rather than the business it was. "Why don't you just work in an office like a normal person?" her father had asked dismissively, when she'd proudly shown them the lease for her first shop. "Baking is fun, sweetheart, but it's not a career," her mother had added. Meanwhile, when Nathan decided he wanted to be an entrepreneur, they had eagerly poured money into his ideas. First a trendy nightclub that closed within 6 months, then a luxury car rental business that never made it past the website stage. Each time he failed, they made excuses. The market wasn't right, he had bad business partners, or it just wasn't his passion. But when Melissa struggled to get her bakery off the ground, their response was cold. "Well, that's the risk you take when you go into business." Even family events had revolved around Nathan's needs. When Melissa finally saved up enough for a short vacation, she had to cancel because their parents needed her to help Nathan move into his new apartment, an apartment he had barely lived in before moving in with Claire. When she graduated from culinary school, the celebration was overshadowed because Nathan had just announced his engagement, and that, of course, was far more important. "You don't mind, do you?" her mother had asked, barely waiting for a response before redirecting attention to Nathan's proposal story. And now, years later, they expected her to give up her house, the one thing that symbolized her years of hard work, so Nathan could maintain his lavish lifestyle a little longer. Melissa clenched her jaw. They would never ask him to make sacrifices for her. They would never expect him to suffer the way they expected her to. And the worst part? Nathan wasn't even ashamed of it. He had spent his whole life being told he was special, entitled to more, that someone else would always pick up the pieces for him. Melissa had spent her whole life being told she was strong, independent, code for "you don't get help." But for once, she was done playing that role. This time, she wasn't going to let them take what was hers. Melissa expected her parents to keep pushing, but she hadn't expected them to resort to blackmail. The moment she refused to sell her house, the air in the kitchen shifted, the warmth replaced by something colder, more calculated. Her father leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, while her mother smoothed out the non-existent wrinkles in her blouse, a telltale sign that something unpleasant was coming. "We've been talking to Aunt Evelyn," her father began, his voice softer now, almost regretful, "about that summer you stayed with her during college." A chill ran down Melissa's spine. She set down her coffee cup, careful to keep her expression neutral. She knew exactly what they were referring to. That summer had been a turning point in her life, one she had never spoken about to anyone outside of the family. While staying with Aunt Evelyn, she had accidentally discovered that Evelyn's husband had been funneling money from their family business into secret offshore accounts. He had begged her to stay quiet, swearing he would return the money before anyone found out. Melissa, young and naive at the time, had reluctantly agreed, believing he would fix his mistake, and he did. At least on paper. The money was returned, the business continued as usual, and no one ever knew. Or, so she thought. Now, sitting across from her parents, she realized they were using that buried secret as a weapon. "You know how damaging it would be for Jake," her mother added, her voice heavy with feigned concern. Jake, Aunt Evelyn's son, was running for public office now. If word got out that his father had once been involved in financial misconduct, it could destroy his campaign. "We don't want that to happen," her father said, shaking his head. "But if the wrong people hear about it, well, these things have a way of getting out." Melissa swallowed the bitterness rising in her throat. They were threatening to twist the story, to paint her as an accomplice, rather than someone who had been manipulated into silence. If this scandal resurfaced, it wouldn't just ruin Jake's campaign. It could damage her own business, her reputation. Her customers trusted her. She had built her bakery on community support, on honesty and integrity. A single whisper of scandal could undo everything she had worked for, and her parents knew it. For a brief moment, she considered the easier path, to give in, sell her house, and keep the peace. That's what they were counting on. But then she looked at her father's smirk, at her mother's carefully constructed mask of concern, and something inside her hardened. No, she wasn't the scared, obedient daughter they thought she was. They wanted to use her past against her? Fine, but they had forgotten. Melissa had secrets of her own, and she wasn't afraid to use them. Melissa sat back, letting the weight of their threat settle in the air between them. Her parents stared at her, waiting for her to break, for her to crumble under the pressure like she always had, but this time was different. This time she wasn't just fighting for her house, she was fighting for her house. A slow, knowing smile spread across her lips as she met her father's gaze. "You really think you can blackmail me?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. Her mother flinched at her tone, while her father straightened in his chair, sensing the shift. "Because if we're playing that game, Dad, maybe we should talk about the Henderson property deal." The color drained from her father's face. His fingers, which had been drumming confidently against the table a moment ago, froze mid-tap. Melissa leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. "I have friends at City Hall, you know, and they keep records, very interesting records, like the ones showing how that zoning restriction was miraculously lifted after a few well-placed consulting fees were paid, fees that led directly back to you." She let the words sink in, watching as her father's throat bobbed in a hard swallow. Her mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Melissa, that's not fair." "No, what's not fair," Melissa interrupted, her tone sharp, "is you trying to ruin my life just so Nathan can avoid the consequences of his own." She turned her gaze to her mother now, her voice steady despite the fury simmering beneath the surface. "Or should we talk about Nathan's last business venture? You know, the one you and Dad conveniently forgot to mention to the rest of the family? The one where he took $75,000 from investors, claimed he was launching a real estate consulting firm, and instead funneled the money into designer suits, first-class vacations, and a new car?" Her mother's face turned ghostly pale. "We were protecting him," she whispered. "No," Melissa said coldly, "you were enabling him, just like you always have, and now you want me to give up my home, my security, just to keep him afloat a little longer?" She shook her head. "Not happening." Her father finally found his voice, though it was weaker than before. "You wouldn't expose your own family." Melissa raised an eyebrow. "Wouldn't I?" She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, holding it up just enough for them to see the screen. "I have documents, emails, financial records. I've had them for years, just in case. And I've already sent copies to my lawyer. If you so much as breathe a word of that nonsense about Aunt Evelyn's husband, I promise you, every single one of your dirty secrets will find their way into the hands of people who do care about corruption." The silence that followed was deafening. Her parents exchanged a frantic look, their previous confidence now replaced with something Melissa had never seen from them before: fear. She exhaled, standing up and sliding her phone back into her bag. "I'm done being your scapegoat. I'm done being the responsible one while Nathan gets to make mistake after mistake without consequence. I'm keeping my house, and if you ever try to threaten me again, I won't hesitate to make sure you're the ones who lose everything." She turned and walked toward the door, pausing just long enough to glance over her shoulder. "I suggest you tell Nathan to start looking for a job." Then, without another word, she left, slamming the door behind her. Melissa knew her parents wouldn't back down easily, but she hadn't expected the sheer intensity of their retaliation. The very next morning, the phone calls started. First, it was her mother, her voice trembling with forced sadness. "Melissa, sweetheart, you're tearing this family apart. We just want what's best for everyone." When that didn't work, the guilt-tripping escalated. Her father called, his tone colder, laced with quiet threats. "You need to think carefully about what you're doing. Family doesn't turn its back on family." Melissa hung up. She had made her decision, and she wasn't going to let them manipulate her into changing it. Then came Nathan. He didn't bother with subtlety. He stormed into her bakery 3 times that week, each time making a scene. The first time he pleaded, loud enough for the customers to hear, "Melissa, I'm your brother. How can you be so heartless?" When she refused to engage, he escalated. The second time, he threw a tantrum, shouting about how she was ruining his life, how she was the reason he was losing everything. The third time, he went for full dramatics, collapsing into a chair, clutching his head, moaning, "I'm going to be homeless because of you." Melissa barely looked up from the register. "Nathan, you're moving into a 3-bedroom condo your friend owns. That's not homeless. That's called downsizing." The watching customers snickered, and Nathan stormed out, his theatrics failing to earn him the sympathy he wanted. When emotional blackmail didn't work, their parents switched tactics. Melissa soon found herself the target of a full-scale family intervention, only she hadn't been invited to it. Within days, every aunt, uncle, cousin, and distant relative in their orbit seemed to be calling her, texting her, leaving messages filled with disappointment. "How could you do this to your own brother?" one cousin scolded. "Your parents are devastated," another whispered, as if she had committed some unforgivable crime. Then, her mother made the ultimate move, a formal family dinner, one that was less of an invitation and more of a demand. "Everyone will be there," Deanne had said over the phone, her tone firm. "We need to resolve this as a family." Melissa knew exactly what that meant. They were going to corner her, surround her with a room full of relatives, and pressure her into submission. It had worked before, on birthdays, on holidays, whenever they needed her to fall in line, but not this time. Melissa looked around her bakery, at the business she had built with her own hands, at the life she had fought for. She wasn't the same girl who used to be guilt-tripped into silence. No, this time she would be ready. If her family wanted a confrontation, then she would give them one. But it wouldn't be the ambush they were expecting. It would be a reckoning, and she was prepared to make sure that for once, they would be the ones left speechless. Melissa arrived at her parents' house that Saturday evening, her shoulders squared and her chin high. She had dressed with quiet precision. Black slacks, a simple blouse, pearl earrings, nothing flashy, nothing that would give them an excuse to dismiss her as bitter or dramatic. But her true armor was in the bag slung over her shoulder, a tablet filled with facts, receipts, and the truth they had long ignored. As she stepped through the front door, she was immediately met with the hushed whispers of her relatives, their eyes darting toward her before quickly looking away. The air in the house was thick with tension, but Melissa wasn't here to make peace. She was here to make her stand. At the center of the living room, Nathan sat perched on the couch, his head down, the very picture of a wronged man. Their mother, Diane, stood beside him, gently rubbing his back, while their father, Harold, stood at the head of the room, commanding the floor like a judge about to deliver a verdict. "We're here to talk about family," Harold announced, as Melissa stepped inside, his voice carefully measured. "We all make sacrifices for each other, and lately, there's been a serious lack of cooperation from one of us." Melissa's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag, but she remained silent, letting them set their own trap. "Melissa," Diane began, her voice full of carefully rehearsed heartbreak. "We don't understand how you could turn your back on your own brother. We raised you to be better than this." Melissa let out a slow breath, glancing around the room. Jake, their cousin, was there, standing near the window pretending to be uninterested but clearly taking mental notes. Aunt Evelyn, usually cold and distant, was watching closely. Various other relatives, some well-meaning, some just here for the spectacle, stood in clusters, whispering to each other. This was exactly the ambush she had expected. "Before we go any further," Melissa said, her voice level, "I think it's only fair that everyone here gets all the facts." She pulled out her tablet and, with a few taps, connected it to the large living room television. The screen lit up with the first slide, a scanned image of the mortgage documents for her home, complete with her payment history. "This is my house," she said calmly. "I paid for it myself. I worked 60-hour weeks to afford it. No one here helped me, not once. And yet, I'm being asked to give it up for someone who has never worked a real job in his life." Murmurs rippled through the room. Harold's expression darkened. "Melissa, I'm not finished," she cut in, swiping to the next document. Bank statements appeared on the screen, showing the deposits into Nathan's failed business account, the one where $75,000 had disappeared in under 3 months. "This is where the investor money for Nathan's consulting firm went," she continued, her voice crisp. "Not into real estate, not into a business, but into vacations, cars, and shopping sprees." Aunt Evelyn gasped. A few relatives exchanged stunned looks. Nathan shot up from the couch, his face flushed with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I do," Melissa replied smoothly, swiping again. This time an email thread popped up. Exchanges between Harold and city officials regarding the Henderson property deal, the very one she had hinted at earlier. "And here's Dad, pulling strings to get illegal rezoning approvals. You were so quick to blackmail me, Dad. Did you think I wouldn't do my own digging?" The room fell deathly silent. Harold's face went pale, his jaw tightening as he struggled to find the right words. Meanwhile, Diane looked near tears, but Melissa knew better than to fall for the act. The weight of the truth settled over them all. The relatives who had come to shame her now looked uncomfortable, some outright horrified. Even Jake, the politician, was glancing between the screen and his phone, no doubt already calculating the damage control he would need to do. "You see," Melissa said, tucking her tablet back into her bag, "I've spent my entire life being told to sacrifice for this family. I was always the responsible one, while Nathan got excuse after excuse for his failures. But I won't do it anymore." She turned toward her parents, her voice firm. "You threatened me, tried to destroy my reputation, just so Nathan could continue to live off of others? But I'm done playing along." Nathan stormed out of the room, pushing past people, muttering curses under his breath. Their mother hurried after him, calling his name, while their father clenched his fists in rage. "Melissa," Harold hissed, low enough that only she could hear. "If you don't delete those files, you'll regret it." She met his glare with an unwavering stare. "They're already backed up, and if anything happens to me, they'll find their way to every newspaper in town." With that, she turned and walked out the door, leaving behind the family that had tried to break her. They had underestimated her, but now they finally knew. Melissa was no longer someone they could control. Melissa walked out of her parents' house that night feeling lighter than she had in years. For the first time in her life, she had refused to bow under their pressure, refused to be the family's sacrifice. As she drove home through the quiet streets of Portland, she let the reality of what had just happened settle in. She had burned the bridge, and there was no going back. She expected the fallout to be immediate, and she was right. Within hours, her phone was flooded with texts and missed calls. Some were from relatives still trying to guilt-trip her. How could you humiliate your own parents like that? Others were more neutral, even quietly supportive. I had no idea about everything you went through. You were right to stand up for yourself. But the ones that stood out the most were from her parents. Her mother's messages swung wildly between pleading and fury, while her father's were short and cold. "You've made a terrible mistake." Melissa didn't respond. Instead, she blocked their numbers. Over the next few days, the silence was both unnerving and freeing. Nathan didn't show up at her bakery again. Her parents stopped trying to call. It was clear they weren't giving up. They were regrouping, figuring out their next move. But Melissa wasn't going to play their game anymore. She threw herself into her work, pouring her energy into her bakery. She adjusted her displays, introduced new seasonal pastries, and focused on expanding her customer base. She had spent so much of her life being the responsible one for everyone else. Now it was time to be responsible for herself. The true test came a week later, when she heard through a mutual friend that Nathan had moved back in with their parents. He hadn't found a job, hadn't taken any responsibility for his situation. Instead, their parents had done what they always did: rescued him, coddled him, let him avoid the consequences of his own actions. Melissa felt no satisfaction in hearing it, just confirmation that she had made the right choice. If she had given in, she would have been right back in their cycle of manipulation, expected to be their safety net while Nathan continued to drain them dry. For the first time, she was free. She wasn't the family's fixer anymore, and she was never going to be again. In the weeks that followed, Melissa adjusted to her new reality, a life without the weight of her family's expectations pressing down on her. At first, the silence felt strange. She had spent so long bracing for the next demand, the next guilt trip, that waking up without a new crisis to fix almost felt unnatural. But then, something shifted. The bakery felt different, lighter, as if the absence of stress had physically transformed her regular customers noticed too. "You seem different," one of them commented as she handed over a fresh-baked croissant. "Happier." And for the first time in years, Melissa realized she was. Without the endless emotional drain of her family, she had more energy to pour into her business. She revamped her marketing, hired another part-time employee, and finally launched the online store she had been putting off for months. The changes paid off almost immediately. Sales increased, and for the first time, she wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. Her bakery was no longer just a business. It was a symbol of everything she had built on her own, proof that she had never needed their approval to succeed. Then, out of the blue, she received a letter from Aunt Evelyn. It was handwritten on expensive stationery, the script neat and deliberate. "Melissa, I see things clearly now. I should have spoken up sooner. You were always the strong one, but that didn't mean you deserved to carry everyone else's burdens. I admire what you did." The words caught her off guard. She had never expected anyone in her family to acknowledge what she had endured, let alone validate her choice to walk away. Nathan, on the other hand, had learned nothing. The last she heard, he was still living with their parents, still expecting them to clean up his messes. Their father's business deals had come under scrutiny, and their mother had been forced to scale back her lavish lifestyle. The golden child was still golden, but the shine was starting to wear off. And yet, Melissa felt no anger toward them anymore. She had carried the weight of resentment for years, but now, standing in the life she had built for herself, she realized she no longer needed to hold on to it. Her freedom wasn't just about cutting ties, it was about choosing herself, about finally letting go of the idea that she owed them anything. She was done looking back. The future was hers now. 3 years had passed since Melissa had walked out of her parents' house and reclaimed her life, and not once had she looked back with regret. The bakery had flourished beyond her expectations. What had once been a modest, single-location shop was now a thriving business with a second storefront across town and an online store that shipped her pastries nationwide. The long hours and sleepless nights were still there, but they were hers, dedicated to something she loved, something she built with her own hands. She had built a life on her own terms, and for the first time, she wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. The irony of it all wasn't lost on her. Had her parents, and Nathan, not tried to manipulate her into selling her home, she might have stayed trapped in their endless cycle of expectations. Instead, their betrayal had pushed her towards something greater: freedom. They had tried to make her feel selfish for choosing herself, but in the end, it was their selfishness that had left them with nothing. Nathan had burned through every option. His second marriage had ended in a divorce just as messy as the first, and his latest business idea had collapsed before it even got started. He was still living with their parents, still waiting for someone to bail him out. Meanwhile, their father had been forced into early retirement after whispers of his shady business deals grew too loud to ignore. Their mother had lost her social standing, her country club membership revoked, when their finances started to dwindle. They were still stuck in the same cycle of enabling and excuses, but Melissa was no longer a part of it. One afternoon, she ran into her cousin Jake at a coffee shop downtown. He had always been one of the more pragmatic relatives, never fully aligning himself with their parents' antics. As they exchanged pleasantries, he gave her a knowing look. "You know," he said, stirring his coffee, "Aunt Helen still says that if you had just helped Nathan that first time, none of this would have happened." Melissa had expected that. Her parents would always see her as the one who broke the family apart, rather than the one who finally refused to be broken by them. She just smiled. "Of course they do," she said simply. But she didn't care. Their opinions had no power over her anymore. That evening, Melissa walked through the doors of her home, the one she had fought to keep. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a testament to her strength, her resilience, her refusal to be used. As she set down her bag and glanced around at the warm, welcoming space she had made truly her own, she felt something deep inside her settle. She had chosen herself, and it had been the best decision of her life. She had won. Melissa's journey teaches a powerful lesson about self-worth, boundaries, and the importance of choosing oneself. For years, she was the responsible one, the fixer, the person expected to sacrifice for the sake of family. But as she learned, family loyalty should never come at the cost of self-respect. The moment she refused to be manipulated, she gained something far more valuable than approval. She gained freedom. Her story highlights that being the strong one doesn't mean carrying everyone else's burdens. While her family wanted to keep enabling Nathan's irresponsibility, Melissa realized that helping someone isn't the same as rescuing them from their own choices. Sometimes, the best thing you can do is step back and let people face the consequences of their actions. Another key takeaway is that success means nothing if you allow others to take it from you. Melissa fought for everything she had, and by standing her ground, she not only protected her home but also flourished in ways she never imagined. In the end, her strength wasn't just about saying yes to her family, it was about saying yes to herself. The true victory in life isn't pleasing others, it's building a life you're proud of.